So today we're going to talk about some of these endocrine glands, most of them, and we'll talk about some of the hormones they produce, what effects they have. As we get closer to next week and we're going to have a quiz, I'll be a little bit more specific about which hormones you have to know by name and so forth for the quiz. But we'll talk about them all now. So we have a few different diagrams here in your notes to help you understand some of these. So don't worry right now about labeling that diagram. This shows most of the endocrine glands. Talks a little bit about what their function is. So let's just review some of them. So the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is in the brain. It's actually neural tissue. Okay, it's part of your brain. Okay, and it's really the linkage between the brain and most of the endocrine system. Okay, and so the hypothalamus, it does several things. It actually makes some hormones, which it sends into the pituitary gland to be stored and later released. It also makes these releasing factors, these compounds that stimulate the pituitary gland to release many of its various hormones. So what you're going to find here is, especially with the hypothalamus, with the pituitary gland, is the glands produce hormones which stimulate other glands to produce other hormones, and this sort of cascading effect of hormones. And so it gets a little bit complicated, but the hypothalamus basically stimulates the pituitary gland to do its job. Also up there in the brain is the pineal gland, which regulates melatonin, which you probably maybe you've heard of. Some people take melatonin at night as a sleep aid, because melatonin is a compound that helps regulate our sleep-wake cycles. It's also, some people say, I don't know if anyone has an iPhone and recently upgraded to iOS 9.3, you may have turned on the night shift feature of your phone. Has anyone heard of that?
Oh yeah.
No.
What does it do? It takes
What does it do, Nate?
it takes because your phone was like a GPS. It takes where you are, and so it knows when the sun is down. So
Yep.
it knows how to turn off the blue light on your screen.
Yeah, so
it doesn't keep you awake.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So it changes the color of the light being produced by your iPhone or iPod or whatever it is. And because some people will say that strong blue light towards the blue side of the wavelength can interfere with melatonin production, okay, in your brain. Your brain sort of stores up melatonin that regulates your sleep cycle. And so some people say looking at computer screens, tablets, phones at night is not good for you, that it disrupts sort of your natural sleep cycle. So some people actually, previously, some people had special glasses they wore that block that blue light, and they say that the warmer colors, the yellowish light, is not as damaging to that sleep-wake cycle. And so now the new iPhone software actually has an option you can turn on, and at sunset in your area, it turns the color of your phone from a strong blue to a warmer tones to help manage that a little bit. But anyway, melatonin is one hormone responsible for sleep-wake cycles. Then we have the pituitary gland, way up in the brain, hugely important. It basically controls almost all of the other glands of the body. Okay? Sometimes it's called the master gland, and we'll look at in a minute the various hormones it produces that help regulate other glands. In your neck area, okay, around your trachea, you have the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is responsible for producing a few different hormones. Thyroxine is one of them, which helps regulate your metabolism, so how your body uses energy. Okay? That happens in the thyroid gland. It also regulates calcium levels, along with the parathyroid gland. Because in the thyroid gland are these four little sort of dots that are on it that are called the parathyroid glands. And they produce hormones which regulate calcium in the blood. So they work together. The pancreas in your abdomen, tucked sort of behind your stomach. We know it has digestive functions by producing pancreatic juices, but it also has endocrine functions and you know a lot about insulin and monitoring the blood glucose. We talked about that yesterday. The adrenal glands, okay, sit atop your kidneys. They're little hats on top of the kidneys, okay? And the adrenal glands, their job is to produce, there's two areas of the adrenal glands. They produce different types of hormones, but they produce stress hormones. They produce adrenaline, which I'm sure you heard of. Epinephrine, it's also called, or norepinephrine. And these are hormones which poise your body for what we call the fight or flight response. That as you get scared or startled or attacked, your adrenal glands kick in and start this response of your heart rate increasing, of your blood pressure increasing, of mobilizing glucose in your blood to give you the energy to escape the threat that may be present. The thymus is a gland that functions mostly in childhood that stimulates the body to produce white blood cells. Then in ovaries and testes are obviously have reproductive functions in terms of making gametes, sperm and egg cells, but they also have major endocrine functions. Okay? The ovaries produce hormones responsible for secondary sex characteristics. They produce hormones for uterine lining maintenance during the menstrual cycle. The testes produce testosterone, responsible for male secondary sex characteristics and many other things as well. So those are all endocrine glands. We'll look at them a little more detail in some of these other slides. So we talked yesterday about the pancreas and insulin and glucose. This is complex looking diagram. Basically shows that pituitary gland. That's what this is showing, an enlargement of the hypothalamus, which again is in the brain, and the pituitary gland. Okay? And so if we look at this sort of from a top-down approach, the hypothalamus, so it has these cells, these neurosecretory cells. They're neurons really, with these long axons, and they actually produce, some of these neurosecretory cells, like over here, actually produce hormones, ADH, and they also produce oxytocin. So these hormones are produced here, and then those hormones travel down into the posterior pituitary gland, where they're basically stored there. And then the posterior pituitary releases those hormones when it's appropriate, when conditions require. And so, you know, the ADH hormone, vasopressin, we talked about when we talked about diabetes insipidus, and that regulates urine production and vasoconstriction as well, constricting of the arteries. It also produces oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that's responsible for contraction of the uterus. For example, when my wife was going into labor for my first daughter, her water had broken. She hadn't gone into labor quickly enough for what the doctor wanted, so they gave her an injection called Pitocin, which is basically this hormone, oxytocin, in a synthetic form, and that causes contractions to begin and can put a woman into labor. So it regulates the smooth muscle contractions of the uterus. Also helps regulate milk production in mammary glands after childbirth as well. So those hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus, sent to the pituitary gland, and then released. The other side of the pituitary gland is the anterior pituitary gland. And again, in the anterior pituitary gland, these cells, they produce these releasing factors. There's many different types of them. And they stimulate, okay, the anterior pituitary gland to produce one of its hormones. And it produces a whole bunch of hormones. It produces hormones that stimulate the thyroid gland, that stimulate the adrenal glands, that produce prolactin, responsible for milk production. It produces growth hormone, which causes bones to increase in length and muscle development. It produces FSH and LH, hormones involved in reproduction that affect the reproductive glands. So all of these other various hormones are produced here in the pituitary gland. That's why it's called the master gland. It's sort of in charge of many of the other endocrine glands. And here's an example of that. Okay? This is the hypothalamus, obviously. And these diagrams show parts of the adrenal glands. So here's the kidney. Atop the kidney is this little hat. That's the adrenal gland. And that adrenal gland has two parts, an interior portion called the medulla, and then an exterior portion called the cortex. And they each produce different hormones. So the hypothalamus produces these releasing hormones. They stimulate the pituitary gland, okay, which secretes hormones, okay, into the bloodstream. These hormones are called adrenocorticotropic hormones. And then they go, and once they reach the adrenal glands, they stimulate them to produce their hormones. The hormones of the cortex, they produce sort of long-term stress hormones. Okay? Mineralocorticoids, which regulate sodium and water retention by the kidneys. They increase blood pressure. Glucocorticoids, which produce glucose, inhibit the immune system a little bit. And part of this is the reason why long-term stress is damaging to our health. Because when we are in a stressful situation, these hormones are produced, and you may know that if you are stressed out, you have a ton of schoolwork, or things aren't going well at home, or whatever is going on, and you have like long-term stress, those are times when you often can get sick, right? And then you may get a cold, you may get strep throat or something when you've not been sleeping well, and all those things. And part of that is because of the effects of these hormones. They have sort of some of these negative effects on our body, right? Higher blood pressure, immune system repression. But then there are also these sort of short-term hormones produced by the adrenal glands. These are things like adrenaline. So if you're walking in April Fools and you're walking back in your house and your brother's hiding in the closet and you don't know he's home, and he jumps out and scares you and you're like freaking out, you are going to have a quick release of adrenaline. Your nervous system, as soon as you have that perceived threat, your nervous system sends a signal into the adrenal medulla, the interior of the adrenal glands. They will release a flood of adrenaline, also called epinephrine, into your blood. And that has some quick-acting, strong effects. Things that, if you haven't been really scared, are familiar. Things like your blood pressure rises, your breathing rate increases, your heart rate increases, your metabolic rate increases. You have a flow of glucose into your blood from your liver. All those things, really, in terms of natural selection, they're adaptations that in the past were for us to escape some threat. That, you know, you're walking through the woods and a cougar jumps out and is about to attack you. Your adrenal response is for you to have enough energy, to have the awareness to quickly evade that situation, to get away. Now, nowadays, we don't have many of those threats, but we can trick our body into going on a roller coaster and scaring ourselves into releasing some of these hormones, which give us that like excited feeling that you get if you're on a roller coaster, you go in a haunted house or something like that. So those are the responses from the adrenal glands. Our thyroid gland and the parathyroid, they're responsible for the maintenance of calcium levels. And again, they balance out, they work opposite to each other in order to maintain the proper level of calcium. So we need the right amount of calcium in our blood. If calcium levels increase, then our thyroid goes into action. It produces this hormone called calcitonin. What calcitonin does is that hormone stimulates our bones, okay, to store some of that calcium. And so calcium comes out of our blood and is stored in our bones. It tells our intestines to decrease how much calcium they're absorbing from our foods because we have high levels in our blood. They decrease the amount of calcium that our kidneys reabsorb. And all those things result in a lowering of calcium levels, and we're back at homeostasis. If the opposite happens, if our calcium levels in our blood drop too low, then another gland, the parathyroid, those four little dots on the thyroid, they kick into action. Okay? They produce parathyroid hormone. which does the opposite. It takes some calcium out of our bones, puts it into our blood, increases how much our intestines absorb from our foods. Okay? It increases the reabsorption from our kidneys, and that brings the calcium level in our blood back up, and again, we're at homeostasis. So that's how this feedback sort of works, constantly balancing to keep conditions. You know, this is the same thing as insulin and glucagon, balancing out glucose levels. One increases glucose, one decreases it, and those levels help us to maintain our blood sugar level. This diagram is the one I just gave you. And again, it's very difficult to see here, but the copy I gave you with the black border, it basically is showing you those hormones, most of which we just talked about. So if we just sort of look at this list, it starts at the top with the hypothalamus, regulatory gland, which releases hormones into the posterior pituitary and produces hormones that regulate the anterior. If you look at the pituitary section, look at that list for the pituitary gland. All of those hormones regulate other body parts. So that's why we call that pituitary gland a master gland. It produces all of these other hormones that are listed there. We have the thyroid gland, okay, the parathyroid for calcium. On the back, we have the pancreas we talked about for monitoring and adjusting blood glucose. The adrenal glands for those stress hormones. Testes and ovaries, okay, which produce those reproductive hormones. The pineal gland, and then the thymus. And so what you see here on this chart, you have the glands, you have which hormones they produce. You also have the class, so you can see which of these are steroid hormones and which are non-steroid amino acid or protein hormones. So you know which are single messenger and which are two messenger hormones. You see what their actions are. And you also, in that far column, tell you what helps to regulate these hormone levels. So which other feedback systems they are sort of listening in for to adjust. So that's kind of a summary of the stuff that we talked about today. Any questions? We'll finish up on Monday. Any questions about any of the hormones or glands we covered?